Greetings. My name is Elizabeth Hoover. I'm an associate professor in the Environmental Science and Policy Management program at the University of California, Berkeley. And I want to thank Dr. Frank Kupka and Dr. Overstreet for inviting me here, I guess wherever here is today, to talk to you about food sovereignty. So I'm quite sorry that we can't all be together there in person visiting about this, but I'm going to do my best to share a little bit of the work that I have been doing over the last several years in visiting with different food sovereignty projects around the country, and be thinking about how that can be connecting to some of the really interesting work that's now happening over at College of Menominee Nation. And I'm here in my virtual cornfield so that I can kind of pretend that I am there with you all doing the field trips that we would have been doing. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Great, so today I'm going to talk to you about community farming, gardening, and food sovereignty in Indian country. So some of my favorite photos of adventures here, we have Rowan White on the right-hand side, who directs some of the projects for the Indigenous Seedkeepers Network and also runs the seed farm in California. And we have some Onondaga white corn there. That's April holding a nice handful from the Onondaga farm out in what is now called New York State. And then Brian Yazzie doing some plating of some of his fabulous food at a sous chef event a few years ago in Minneapolis. So in thinking about food sovereignty, this term gets thrown around a lot, it gets used a lot. It originally came out of the La Via Campesina peasant movement in South America. That movement has spread around the world, and there was a conference in 2007 in which people came from around the world to gather for this meeting. And the short definition that they came up with for what is food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So that was an important aspect of it there. It's not having people from other parts of the world come in and tell you how you should be doing your farming systems, but for a community to be able to define their own and to be eating culturally appropriate, healthy food. So this is kind of in contrast to the idea of food security. You hear a lot about food security projects, which is ensuring that people have enough calories to live a healthy life, but doesn't necessarily focus as much on what are the processes that go into getting those calories to you. It doesn't focus as much on people having control over their own food systems. The food justice movement is another really important movement happening here in the US that wants to ensure equal access to safe, healthy food, wants assurances that workers within the food system are treated fairly, and wants some accounting for the value of food in relation to the self-determination of communities. So the food justice movement is saying everyone should have equal access to these food systems. The food sovereignty movement is saying, okay, we don't just want equality within the current system, but we want to have control over our own systems. So these are individual communities saying, okay, we want this level of control over how our food is being produced. Indigenous food sovereignty, that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, takes that food sovereignty movement to a deeper level and says, okay, we need to recognize these social, cultural, and economic relationships that underlie these community food sharing. And those relationships need to be nurtured in order for that food system to be healthy. And it recognizes the sacred responsibilities to nurture those relationships to land-based food and political systems. So many Indigenous people, as part of thinking through what is food sovereignty, say, okay, we don't just want land to farm on, we want our land, and we want access to our specific land that our ancestors ate off of in order to be food sovereign. So why is it that Native American people, specifically in the US, are fighting for food sovereignty? What happened to make it so that communities aren't food sovereign? You see I've subtitled this the Whirlwind History of Settler Colonialism in North America. It starts with scorched earth battle tactics. And so, General Sullivan, George Washington sends him forth and says to lay waste to their fields, to Haudenosaunee communities as punishment for not backing the Americans during the American Revolution. Before him, the French did the same thing when they saw the amazing food stores that Haudenosaunee people had and the political power that having that much stored food brought. And Jane Mount Pleasant has done some great work in looking at why Haudenosaunee people were able to produce so much food. So people intentionally attacked these food sources as a way of politically weakening communities. This also happened, for Navajo people who were forced on the long walk, for families who didn't immediately relocate as they were told. Kit Carson and his men burned their fields and burned their crops of sheep. The buffalo were intentionally slaughtered and left for dead as a way of starving Native nations into having to move on to reservations. So settlers understood early that if you attack people's food sources, they become weaker and easier to push around. There was also a lot of theft of land and forced relocations. So this is everything from the different trails of tears that many communities faced when they were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. As I mentioned, the Navajo Long Walk. There were other nations that were pushed off land and whose land bases were shrunk. So the Allotment Act took those land bases that were already pretty small that people had agreed to via treaties, and then broke that land into individual allotments that were then often taken from people. So that took already shrunken land bases and made them even smaller, making it harder for people to produce food in traditional ways the way that they always would have. The boarding school system, for many people, the 1870s up through the 1950s, and even later on the East Coast, it started even earlier. But the intention of these boarding schools was to forcibly assimilate Native youth, forcing them into a European education. And part of that was around food systems as well. And so, youth that were brought to these boarding schools were taught to farm the way their Euro-American teachers thought they should be farming, rather than traditional methods of farming or other ways of gathering food. The Bureau of Indian Affairs also promoted Western farming methods and seeds from the late 19th century onward. Many of these tribes that were forced onto smaller reservations, whether or not they had in the past several generations done a lot of farming, this European style of farming was seen as the only way to efficiently produce food. And so people were forced into this kind of farming. And then even among some nations that had been farming for a long time, for example, the Hopi in the Southwest, the Bureau of Indian Affairs said, no more of this dry land farming. You need to irrigate, you need to use our seeds. And then later when it was like, oh, now we have oversalination and other issues. I guess the way that you were farming before was pretty good. But by then, the land tenure system had been disrupted. People's passing down of heirloom seeds in some cases was disrupted. So it was very disruptive for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to go in and be forcing this style of farming onto people. You had the co-optation and commodification of native seeds by non-native collectors, seed breeders, ag companies. So you had people profiting off of indigenous seeds, even as they were making it much harder for indigenous communities to continue using those seeds. Current issues, we have climate change that's making it more challenging for people to know what to grow and how to grow it, and where to find the foods that they may have always found in particular places. There's concern about cross-contamination with GMO seeds for people who are working on planting heirloom seeds whose neighbors may be planting genetically modified seeds. Some communities face lack of access to land. There are people that don't have access to enough tools and seed to do some of the kinds of farming that they would like to. And some of the people I talked to said, well, we just wish more people in the community were interested and wanted to take part in this. And a big part of many of the efforts that I'm going to talk about here today is getting people interested in those things again. So what happens as a result of all of these impacted food systems? Prior to 1940, you had very few cases of type 2 diabetes. Now it's the 7th leading cause of death for Native people. According to the US Indian Health Service, the death rate for American Indians because of diabetes is 249% greater than other Americans. So there are real health impacts of having to switch to a very different food system, having to rely on commodity foods and other pre-packaged foods that are full of sodium and sugar. And just to shout out to the people who are doing the food distribution program on Indian reservations. There's a lot of effort now being put into including fresher foods, including more traditional foods into that system. But for a very long time, it was cans of high sodium, high sugar foods and dry goods. So switching from being able to have access to a lot of lean meats and forage foods and traditional horticulture foods to these prepackaged foods, as you can see, has had a big health impact. And it's also not been good for economies. So the White Earth Land Recovery Project did a survey several years ago where they found that the members of their community spend $8 million a year on food, 7 million of which is spent off reservation. So the effort is, how do you keep some of those food dollars in the community in order to help the economies that way? So there, I've gone through the grim statistics, the grim history. I think it's important to acknowledge that, but we don't want to get stuck in just the grimness. So Eve Tuck is a Native scholar who talks about doing desire-based research, not just damage-based research. So again, acknowledging what some of those grim statistics are, but not getting stuck there and just in a rut of doing that over and over. So what are Native communities doing to address this problem? People aren't just laying down and dying and giving up, but there are community efforts to grow more healthy food, to grow more heirloom crops, and to eat better. And I started thinking about this issue when I was living in Akwesasne and working with a bunch of friends with an organization called Ganahio Yongaya Dohage, or We Are Planting Good Seeds. And this is a community-based group that's been working to try to get people back into farming and gardening and seed saving and getting more youth excited about these projects as well. I was there working on this book, The River is in Us, Fighting Toxics in a Mohawk Community, where I write about some of the impacts on farming systems from the environmental contamination and the efforts that people are doing now to get back into planting more heirloom seeds and eating more local foods. So as part of, working with people on these issues and thinking about, what does food sovereignty mean? How are other communities trying to get these projects off the ground? How are they getting youth involved? Where are they getting funding? All these questions. I started attending different food sovereignty summits and meeting people who had all these really cool projects all over the country. And so I decided I was going to learn more about this by jumping in the car and driving 20,000 miles around the country. And I popped into 40 different communities to do interviews with people about, what are you doing to try to address these issues? And I focused specifically on farming and gardening projects because this had been my experience growing up. I grew up on a little hobby farm in upstate New York and spent a lot of time with chickens and growing all kinds of food crops. And this had been my experience in Akwesasne, was working with gardeners. So I decided, the food sovereignty movement is much broader than this. There are people who are doing foraging and hunting and fishing and all these other ways of gathering food. But I was specifically interested in how are people using farming and gardening. So these are a few of the sites I popped into. And then I started this blog called From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds, Indigenizing the Local Food Movement, because people were like, hey, I want to be able to see what everybody else is doing too. I want to know, what's going on in other parts of Indian country around farming and gardening and food, but somebody has to stay here and weed the garden. So I did the blog as a way of kind of in more real time, being able to put up pictures and put up the stories of the people that I was talking about. So I invite you to go visit that blog. And then all of this material is also going toward a book that I'm working on right now. So some of the questions that I was asking Native farmers were around how did their groups get started, some of the successes and challenges they were facing, how are they defining food sovereignty, how are they deciding what qualifies as an heirloom seed or an indigenous seed, where did they get their funding for these community-based projects, is there funding that people won't pursue or accept? So some people were like, you can't decolonize if you're taking food or money for food from the federal government. You know, if you're accepting money from all these big corporations, how are you decolonizing? And other people said, you know, give me your dirty Walmart money and I will plant it and I will grow food. So there were some divergences in where people were willing to take funding from. And also, you know, thinking about what recommendations did people have for other communities wanting to start a project like this. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how are people defining food sovereignty? What did that mean specifically in these different communities? And a big part of it, you know, I started with some of the grim statistics, was around health. A lot of these projects were motivated by a desire to want to restore physical health, so to address some of the diabetes and other metabolic disorders, but also cultural and spiritual health, which people saw as very connected to physical health as well. And then Melissa Nelson, in the interview that I did with her, talked about eco-cultural health as well. So the way that the health of the land and the people are inextricably linked. And so the people have to get healthier in order to be out on the land and helping the land to be healthy, and vice versa. If the land that you're working on is not healthy, neither will the people be who are eating and living there. Culturally appropriate foods were seen as especially important. So it's not enough just, you know, are you getting enough kale in your diet if that's not something that is culturally meaningful to you, but a focus on traditional foods because they have cultural meaning and context that's important to maintain. So people recognize that a decline in access to traditional food has led to culture and language loss. And then on the flip side, part of culture and spiritual recovery is recovering those traditional foods as well. And in many communities, the creation stories are connected with food. So people have stories about how corn came to them from some of the original beings in creation stories. And it was important to be able to connect to those stories by still having access to those foods. Roberto Nutt Lewis, who is Navajo, who works at the Black Mesa Water Coalition, who took this photo here, described corn to me as biological and spiritual nourishment for people. So it wasn't, so it's not just about, are you getting enough vitamins in your diet, but are you nourishing your spirit as well? And then the importance of naming traditional foods. So when I was visiting with the Muskogee Food Sovereignty Initiative, a woman named Stephanie, who was working there, talked about how, you know, they have this Indian pumpkin. And she was like, well, we need to get the Creek name back for this pumpkin because all the pumpkins are Indian pumpkins. And I know that's not what our Creek ancestors called it. So we need to be able to call this pumpkin by its name. So there's a connection of revitalizing language and revitalizing these culturally appropriate foods. There's a real focus on relationships, and I mentioned that in the beginning as part of the definition of Indigenous food sovereignty. So working on relationships between people and each other as part of the projects, but also people in the land, people in the food, and the land and the food. Clayton Bracapay, who you see here, who runs the Traditional Native American Farmers Association, talks about seeds as our living relatives. And so it's a very different way of thinking about your food source when you think about how it can be related to you. Bob Shimmick, who is up at White Earth, was describing the true measure of food sovereignty is when you have that reciprocal relationship where Anishinaabe is thriving, as are all of our plant, animal, bird, fish relatives. That's food sovereignty, when it's all lockstepping together in what we call Minobamadawisan, the good life. So thinking about all those different relatives and how are they all thriving together, and that's how we define the good life. A focus on independence was seen as an important part of food sovereignty. So being able to produce enough food for the community without outside interference from different government or multinational companies, especially when it came to traditional foods. So part of this Cochiti Youth Enrichment Project in Cochiti Pueblo, the effort is how do you get more youth growing produce, but also how do you make sure that there's enough of the traditional corn that's needed for the different feast days, for the different family events, because it's hard to get that corn anywhere else unless you're growing it there. So a big part of food sovereignty was making especially sure that those culturally important crops are being grown in the community. And thinking about individual independence, but also community and tribal self-sufficiency. And there's an economic angle to it. So as I mentioned on that survey in the beginning, how do we keep food dollars within the community rather than all of it hemorrhaging out to businesses outside of the community? Some people are working with farmers markets, TSAs, tribally supported agriculture. So you see this photo here of one of the youth from the Garden Warriors program, which is part of Dream of Wild Health. So their youth are taught everything from planting the seeds in the ground, bringing up those crops, and then taking it to the farmer's market and selling it there. And then how do you open a checking account? How do you save funds? So it's really kind of a seed to a different kind of bank kind of program. There are native chefs out there who are really putting a lot of effort into supporting native food producers specifically. So Takabe in Denver has a native first buying policy where they get as much of their food as they can from native providers and then turn to other local food providers. A lot of the sous chef team, when they go do regional dinners, they're looking to see, Sean's shopping around to see who can they buy from the native communities in the regions where they're cooking. So to bring attention to those native food producers there. And they also work with Dream of Wild Health. So there's this effort to reconnect the trade networks. So if any of you have been at events where you see Dan and his mobile farmers market table, he's really popularized this term of reconnecting the trade networks. How do you get tribal communities to support each other by buying each other's food products? And the reality that it's a real struggle for nonprofit projects to become economically sustainable. So a lot of the nonprofit groups that I visited with talked about how, you live by the grant, you die by the grant. So trying to find ways to become economically sustainable while still being affordable to their community members. Access was a big part of it. So, people wanting access to healthy, culturally relevant food and challenges around how do you get access to these foods. So the cost of food is a challenge, the availability of food, access to land. And I included this photo that we took in 2014 at the Mushkiki Gitagan Karma Market, where, that tomato that she's picking up, if you make a decent amount of money, you may leave a couple dollars for that tomato. You might leave $5 for that tomato if you're feeling really generous. If you are a single parent who is unemployed trying to feed your family, you might take that tomato for free, or you might leave 25 cents. So thinking about ways of redistribution in that way. Part of food sovereignty are the decisions and choices that people are making. So Valerie Segrest, who's a really great Muckleshoot nutritionalist, talks about how food sovereignty is a method of making food choices. And so she encourages the people that she's working with to be very conscious in those choices. And similarly, Don Sharnan, who's here at Junhinkwa and Oneida watering some plants, was saying, if you really want to exercise food sovereignty, you need to make decisions for it. So it can't just be lip service. You need to make the decisions to support your local food producers or to plant that food for yourself. It's also about control, recognizing if you control the food system, you control the people. So as Amos Hinton, who is here holding some of the corns that he was working with there, with the Ponca Nation, said if you don't raise your own food, someone else is controlling your destiny. So a lot of these projects are trying to help people regain control over what they're eating, and also taking control from big ag corporations. And part of this also is around tribal jurisdiction. So what are tribal nations doing specifically around their own lands that they have jurisdiction over? So how are people passing zoning laws that will protect farmland or protect environments where people are getting food? How are different environmental laws being passed that will protect those resources? How are different tribal nations fighting to make sure that they have some say over treaty lands where food is also procured? And the youth and trying to educate people were some of the major goals of a lot of the different food projects that I went to visit. So different community outreach components to these different food projects, educational components, but then, so because there's this obligation to the future generations, to kids like these cuties here that we're visiting at the Whirling Thunder Garden, because there's a necessity of youth to be part of this movement in order for the movement to be sustainable. Then there's also thinking about food itself as a teacher. So Valerie talks about how food is our greatest teacher without a spoken word. The loss of land, loss of rights, environmental toxins, and cultural repression impede our access to millions of fish teachings. So thinking about not only trying to educate human relatives as part of this, but getting an education from food-bearing relatives. And then seed sovereignty, especially because I was looking at farming and gardening projects, is seen as a really important aspect of food sovereignty. So here's Clayton again at a food summit out at Zizek several years ago, holding some of his corn because he's always traveling with corn. And he talks about protecting our living relatives so they can't be molested, contaminated, or imprisoned. And he says, okay, when I say molested, he's talking about genetically modified seeds, or how are people taking apart your living relatives on a cellular level. And when he talks about imprisoned, you know, the concern is what happens if indigenous seed varieties are patented and people can't interact with them and trade them and sell them in the same way. There's an inherent right to save seed and pass it on to future generations, as he describes. So it's a different kind of relationship than people often have with seed that they're just buying in seed packets from catalogs or from stores. And then Rowan White talks about seed sovereignty as the ability to define our relationship to that seed based on our own values and not the values of anyone outside of our community. So the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which is part of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, has been working to try to promote this seed sovereignty in different communities. Rowan's been traveling, well, prior to the pandemic, Rowan had been spending a lot of time traveling around giving different workshops, doing train the trainer model kind of workshops to try to spread that knowledge and ability, because people can be very good gardeners, but gardening specifically for seed saving is a whole other set of skills. As you can see here, Zach doing a hand pollination class with some corn there, and then hosting a lot of seed exchanges so that people can have that real interesting genetic diversity within their gardens by sharing the seed around Indian country. And people saw it as important to be able to plant and save heritage seeds specifically because it establishes this cultural connection to planting. There's a ceremonial context, you know, for some ceremonies you need specific foods and you need to be able to grow those foods to have them. It's important to connect seeds to the land where they were developed. So here at Dream of Wild Health, you see they've planted some Dakota flint corn, and the effort was, how do we get Dakota seeds back into this Dakota ground? And part of that is reestablishing connections to the ancestors who developed those seeds, and developing independence from industrial agriculture by having your own seed source. And people saw these seeds as more nutritious than often what you can get in stores. The effort to get some of these seeds back from different institutions has been under this umbrella of the seed rematriation movement. So people probably have heard of the term repatriation. It's often used when bringing home prisoners of war to their home country, or bringing ancestral remains or sacred objects back to the tribal nations they were taken from. But people have chosen the term rematriation for this particular movement as a way of giving honor to those women seed keepers over the year who've kept those seeds. And because it's not just this one-way arrow of bringing something back, but it's reconnecting Indigenous people to the seeds that their ancestors developed, reconnecting those seeds to the land with which they were developed, and then in the process, connecting Indigenous people back to that land. So some of the different seed rematriation projects, the Science Museum of Minnesota and the Upper Midwest Seed Keepers Network have been working on getting some seeds back from the museum to communities. The University of Michigan and MACPA have been working on getting some seeds returned to people. The Mohawk, Akwesasne Mohawks and others have collaborated with the Hudson Valley Farm Hub in creating a native seed sanctuary. So being able to plant Mohawk seeds back in traditional Mohawk homeland and then returning that seed back to the community. The Seed Savers Exchange grew out and returned some seeds to the Taos Pueblo. And right now the Field Museum in Chicago is working with the Meskwaki community in trying to grow out some of the seeds that have been part of the museum's collections and getting those back into the gardener's possession, if possible. So in thinking about, you know, how are people defining what is a heritage seed? People say, well, as a community, it's important to come up with that definition. For some people, it was passed down through families. In some cases, it's ceremonial songs and other contexts that need to be connected to those seeds. So in some cases, people have been like, well, if it's been away from the community so long and nobody's been singing to it and putting ceremonies on it, is it still the same seed? For other people, it was, okay, the genes in this seed are connected to my ancestors. And so that made them want to reconnect to those seeds, to have those seeds and plant them in their garden. There's also been a role for Native chefs as part of this food sovereignty movement. So on some level, it's how do you get people excited about eating these heirloom seeds and eating these traditional foods? Chefs like Sean Sherman with the Sous Chef and the Ohlone Cafe, these my buddies here, Vincent and Lewis, have talked about all of the different research that they have put into figuring out what is it that Native people have been eating since time immemorial. What were people eating prior to the introduction of European ingredients, and how do you move that food back into people's diets, into people's plates? Part of this Native Chef movement has involved different community meals and trainings at some of the different food summits. So the Great Lake Indigenous Food Summit's culinary mentorship program that's sponsored through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance has been a way of trying to bring in new, burgeoning, excited young chefs to work with people who've been working in kitchens for longer as a way of developing these mentorship networks. So in kind of wrapping up a little bit, there are different levels of food sovereignty that people were talking about as I was doing some of these interviews. So on an individual level, the rights and responsibilities over where your food comes from, what you choose to put in your mouth for each meal. And granted, that is limited for some people more so than others, but thinking about what kind of decisions are you making every time you sit down and have a meal. On a community level, there's the responsibility to make sure that the whole community is getting enough to eat and is self-sufficient, but also thinking about community beyond just who are the humans you hang out with, as the reciprocal relationships between the humans, animal, plant, bird, fish communities, and how are keeping those in balance important to healthy human communities. And then on a political level, tribal governments needing to make sure that people have enough to eat, but also passing policies to support local food producers, protecting habitat and ensuring access to land, fighting federal policies that are not supportive of local food systems and making sure that tribes are passing their own policies, and then also efforts to maintain treaty rights as signed by ancestors to ensure access to traditional foods. So, one of the chapters that I'm working on in wrapping up is, the different successes and challenges in food sovereignty organizing, that you have, some amazing projects and food coming out of it. And there's also struggles. So for the struggle picture, I put one of my squash from a few years ago. There's always going to be bugs and pests and unpredictable weather. But there are also these different organizations like Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, Intertribal Ag Council, that are working to try to support people through these challenges. And also recognizing that the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Movement is a growing and international movement. So these are some photos from a food summit that I went to in Tlaxcala, Mexico, back in 2019, and then an Indigenous Corn Conference in Belize this past spring. And so this is a conversation that's really happening with Indigenous people all up and down Turtle Island. So you can read more about some of these issues in this article that I put out a few years ago. You can't say you're sovereign if you can't feed yourself, defining and enacting food sovereignty in American Indian community gardening. There's also this book that I worked on with Devin Mahesua called Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States. And I wrote a blog post recently and thinking about how does COVID impact all of these different food issues. And so that is up on the Garden Warriors to Good Seeds blog. So in conclusion, as part of being invited to speak here to the College of Menominee Nation, I wanted to highlight the importance of ally scholars and scientists. So the importance of this archaeological work that's being done to unearth all of these different gardens. I had the opportunity to watch a presentation by Dr. Overstreet, and it was really interesting, and especially the importance of this work because for so long things were not documented correctly, and for political reasons. Dr. Overstreet highlights that when people were talking about how are Native people getting their food, it was done in this demeaning way as a way of making people seem less than. So if you only recognize Euro-American style of farming where you clear everything off the land and plant a monocrop, and you look to the way other nations are getting their food, You can say, well, they're not improving the land, they're not properly using the land. And that was a logic that was used to strip tribes of their land. So it's really important to be able to have this evidence to say, no, people produced a lot of food, people had their own way of gardening, and it was really important. Sometimes contemporary research gets caught in the cycle of proving all the worst statistics belong to Native people. So it's important to have work that also demonstrates something beyond that and talks about the way that people have flourished and can and will flourish again. So how does this fit into food sovereignty specifically? European styles of farming were used as a weapon against Native peoples. So, as I mentioned, Native communities that didn't have big farms were deemed as not using their land to the fullest. That land was taken, given to settlers who could use it properly. And so, in some cases, people living out on the plains who hadn't farmed since becoming horse riding, buffalo hunting folks, now found themselves trapped on smaller land bases, forced to use Euro-American styles of farming to coax some kind of food out of the land. For kids that were sent off for boarding schools, farming was like a punishment, essentially. And so now people in some communities are working to reframe that relationship to farming, to going back to traditional ways of doing it, which, as Dr. Overstreet and others' research have demonstrated, was sustainable. It was something that was done for a very long time without stripping the land. So as tribes are reclaiming their food systems, looking back to how their ancestors ate, being able to find out more about the ingenious ways that people used to grow food on the land are windows into how people thought and ate and lived sustainably off the land, but also, again, showing the ways of doing it sustainably. And then I also had the opportunity to see Dr. Frank Kupka's presentation about the College of Menominee Nation's Bachelor in Sustainable Arts program that's coming up. And I think this is so exciting and it's so important. When I was traveling around in 2014, visiting all these different farms, a lot of them, the farm managers were non-Native people because it was seen as a necessity because there weren't necessarily people within the tribal community that had the education and background experience to run a farm. You might have people who are very good at growing their own food, but the particular skills around managing staff and planting for a market and all of the things that go into running a farm were not skills that people in the community yet had. And the only way to remedy this is to have programs that will help people gain that experience. And so I think these kind of sustainable agriculture programs located near tribal communities are a really important way to have community farms that are run by tribal people. So this is how we'll be able to move toward food sovereignty and have a greater quantity of locally grown and sourced food, which, as we saw at the beginning of this pandemic, was a real concern. So I applaud your efforts in getting this program going, and I'm excited to see where it ends up. So here is my email here if people have any questions. There's my favorite game with farmers is what's in your pocket. So this was just one. This was a visit out to the Hudson Valley Farm Hub, and that was Rowan and Ken's pockets that day. So thank you very much. And I look forward to meeting you all in person someday.